Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com.
So greetings, Tim. It's great to have you on the podcast as always.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to be here.
Now, before we go into the meat of our conversation, I did want to ask you something about your origin story. What did you study at university? Was it inevitable you would end up in finance? And something about your journey, your career journey up until now?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm pretty boring. Economics, Manchester University. I went there because the course was very broad, very big, very broad, and I could make lots of interesting choices. And actually, interesting that a lot of their stuff was comparative economics. This was like mid-80s, and it was things like looking at centrally planned economies and China in those days. And I just liked the freedom, really. Anyway, I was kind of, I'm still fairly left-leaning, and I was interested in the Soviet Union and then sort of centrally planned economies and stuff like that. And I did a master's, actually, and in those days, the UK Ministry of Agriculture were giving lots of postgrad stuff for people to do MAs in agriculture economics. So I actually did that, but used it to look at. I did a kind of study of technological change in Soviet agriculture, so I was kind of linking a few things, and that gave me a window, interestingly, into our opportunity. Because I did that, then I got on a project at Exeter University. There was a couple of guys doing some really interesting stuff, looking at, in the Soviet period, this was, right? Late 80s. A couple of guys down there looking at technological change in Soviet agriculture. So we had a Leverhulme project looking at these weird things called science production associations in the Soviet Union. So that was kind of the angle into kind of Russia and Ukraine and stuff. And from there, actually, I did that for 2 years, and then did a couple of years. The Soviet Union collapsed.
So I heard.
Yeah. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union in those days, traveling around with various research institutes in the Soviet Union at the time of the collapse. We were kind of watching it happen. It's kind of interesting. It happened, and then obviously the Communist bloc collapsed in '89 as well during that period.
And just as a side note, I mean, this is a big topic, but what do you think was the cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union? I mean, there's one view, which is, under Reagan, you had this military build-up arms race and it bankrupt the Soviet Union. Another is there's a commodity angle. Oil prices crashed in the 80s, and then that led to the collapse. And then there's other theories as well. I mean, do you have a pet theory on what caused the collapse?
Well, I guess I tend to at the moment to link it into what's going on in Ukraine. And I mean, I would argue that it was the intervention in Afghanistan in the late 80s, which is linked to that. Obviously, the Soviet Union overextended itself, ended up in this arms race, Thatcher, Reagan, all that kind of gig. And it's kind of underlined the inefficiencies in the Soviet system, ultimately. They were in arms race, they simply couldn't win. And then we obviously ended up with perestroika, probably, luck. I mean, if you remember, a couple of Soviet presidents dying in short succession, and then Gorbachev turning up in that period of perestroika, and attempts at reform in a union of 15 republics that really kind of wasn't working, and obviously with centrifugal forces and all that kind of gig. But I mean, incredibly interesting period.
Yeah.
And then to finish off, I mean, I then went to Heriot Watt and worked on transition from plant to market, because by that time there was a transition happening. So it's kind of interesting. So I don't know, I just fell into a lot of things by chance, by luck. I mean, I guess it's often people's careers end up like that, right? I mean,
but it sounds almost like you were going down almost like an academic route, or maybe you could have gone down a policy route, but then you somehow ended up in the financial industry.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I did. I started off definitely in the academic route. From that 4 years of postgrad, I then did a couple of years as a development consultant in transition. I worked a year in Ukraine, in Bilazerk, a place south of Kiev, on a restructuring agro-combinat for the European Union, which was an interesting kind of job. I worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit doing the macro forecasts. And then I ended up at the EIU on a full-time basis after a year in Ukraine, And I guess the EU, you're either a lifer at the EU, being long-term macro forecast. You're either there forever, or you end up 2 years and then go into banking. I mean, that's in the end, that's kind of what I did. There's obviously a lot of demand in that period for people who experienced transition economies, and then I don't know. I just made the leap then into banking, and I was there for sort of 20 odd years, I guess.
Yeah, and you've become obviously an expert in emerging markets, and specifically, obviously, in the former sort of Soviet bloc, you could say. If we kind of fast forward, obviously, to the sort of topic of the day, which is the Russia invasion of Ukraine, it's been going on for, I guess a year now. I guess depends on how you date it. It's been going on for many years before that, but the current hot war, you could say, or the aggressive action was a year on. So what's your kind of latest take on the conflict?
Well, I mean, look, the conflict has been pretty unpredictable. I mean, I think we had a conversation maybe almost a year ago. I mean, some people predicted it would happen. I was one of those. But we all thought it would happen. It would be over fairly quickly, right? I mean, no one imagined the incompetence of Russia's invasion and the brilliance and bravery of Ukraine's defense, right? And actually the unity of the West as well. So there's been many surprises along the way. A conclusion now I've reached and had it for some time is, I just don't see a path to Russian victory. I mean, he's already lost in so many respects, right? He's lost Ukraine permanently. Any pro-Russian supporters, there's not many left. Right? I mean, I speak to a lot of people, Ukrainians, first language Russian, who historically probably were somewhat inclined towards Moscow. And they tell me now that, they're all now speaking Ukrainian, right? I mean, so he's lost Ukraine. There's no way back. Ukrainians will never forgive him. I mean, the defeat, even already the defeat conventionally of the Russian military has been staggering, right? I mean, the sheer amounts of capacity that has been taken out by the Ukrainians, probably half Russia's conventional capability. The myth, the Potemkin myth of Russia's conventional military capability.
Now, you said you were surprised by this before. Now, looking back, was it obvious that the Russian military was weaker than it first appeared, or is it just you just don't know until you see a war start?
Well, I guess you do. I mean, Mike Kaufman, great analyst of the, you never know. Nothing. Battle plans never survive the first point of conflict. I mean, he's often what military guys say. Look, I mean, I think, I thought Russia would play to its advantages straight away, which would be overwhelming use of air power, missiles, artillery, and concentrated on Ukraine's troop concentrations in the east. And I thought, facing, huge casualties, the government in Kiev would be forced to concede. And actually talking to people in Kiev around that time, before and after the actual invasion, I mean, generally they agreed. I mean, they concluded that. And the fact that Russia didn't do that, I mean, the fact that it didn't play to its advantage, hardly used air power so far, is extraordinary, right? And they took, it was badly planned, poor tactics, haphazard. I mean, I think actually for me, it's what actually happened is more reflective of the problem Russia has with Ukraine, right? In its conduct of the invasion, the Russians didn't take Ukraine seriously. Right? They don't take Ukraine and Ukraine. Well, they don't take Ukraine serious as a state. They didn't take Ukrainians serious as a people, right? I mean, you look at Putin's essay that he wrote, in mid 21 prior to the invasion, right? And I just thought, they just honestly thought that the Ukrainians wouldn't fight and they'd welcome them. And there's the stories of the first troops that the first columns that moved in had their dress wear, their ceremonial kit with them. I mean, it was extraordinary. So I mean, it shows. And again, my long experience. I went to Kiev first time in '88. As I said, I've probably been hundreds of times to Kiev, lived the place for a year. I mean, the Russians just can't be bothered. I mean, the Kremlin can't be bothered to really understand Ukraine. they think they get the Ukrainians, but they absolutely don't. And it's been proven. And it's fortunate that they couldn't be bothered to understand Ukraine. They can't be bothered because, essentially, again, they don't see Ukraine as a proper state. They don't see Ukrainians as a proper identity. They look down at them as sort of country bumpkin Russians, which they're absolutely not. And thank God now, with hindsight, that they made such a terrible mistake. And I don't think it's really changed. So, I just, at this point in time, I don't see militarily how Russia can take a significant amount of Ukrainian territory, or significantly more, and hold it. They've mobilized 500,000 troops. Supposedly there's now 500,000 troops in Ukraine or around Ukraine. This autumn mobilization of this offensive that's kind of ongoing at the moment. And despite that, they don't seem to be making any significant inroads. And Ukraine is a huge country. 40 million people look at the map. 500,000 troops is not enough, again, to take and hold a significant amount of Ukrainian territory.
And you mentioned air power. Why haven't they used more air power? As soon as they realized it wasn't a quick victory, why didn't they then deploy the air force and just, aggressively carpet bomb the country or something?
Well, again, extraordinary. Either it's crap, it's not actually what it's made out to be. I think it was just bad planning initially, and now they've missed the opportunity because now Ukraine has some significant air defense capability, and if Russia was to deploy whatever it's got left, the number seems to suggest they probably lost something like 15% of their aeroplanes or their air power. They could still deploy it, but I think Ukrainian air defenses now are fairly significant. So I would imagine that if they deployed their air power now, they would suffer the same fate as their army and their navy in terms of a humiliating performance, basically. So I don't.
And what about like a path to an end here? So you're saying, obviously Russia's captured a part of eastern Ukraine. They're not making additional ground. Ukraine themselves have said they want to remove Russia from all parts of, historic Ukraine. So, will this just be like a endless war where both hold on to what they have, or what, and there's no resolution? How can you have a resolution here?
Well, I don't think the status quo. Putin would love a frozen conflict from here that he keeps.
Okay,
he could sell that as a victory. That's what he would like. Obviously, the Ukrainians don't want that. They know that he will keep whatever he has as long as there's a frozen conflict. They have an interest in continuing this conflict to retake that territory. I think they can. I think the problem for Putin is that the longer it goes on, the more and better equipment the Ukrainians will get, right? So Russia, even if it mobilizes more troops, it presents more poorly trained, poorly armed troops stuck in various places, in Donbass and the southern land corridor. And the Ukrainians have good visibility in terms of their ability to see Russian troop deployments with Western intelligence and, ever more sophisticated kit that they can selectively pick off those troop formations and munition supplies and all that. So I just don't see how it gets any better for Russia, right? Unless it goes for total wartime economy, mass mobilization. Millions in the army, to guns versus butter scenario. And I'm not sure Russians are really ready for that, right? This is not, the Soviet Union sort of, the early 40s, right? Or whatever, 39. Russia has not been invaded. Russia is the invading force. The Russians really want to lose, millions of people fighting for someone else's country? I just really don't see that. So,
and you mentioned Afghanistan earlier. For me, there's two analogies. One is the Chechen, conflict in the 90s, and then obviously before the Afghanistan. Are either one of those two useful reference points to today, do you think?
Well, I would use Afghanistan, but in Afghanistan, I think only 15,000 Soviet troops died. The casualty figures were so much lower, but incredibly unpopular. An incredibly unpopular conflict. Again, a foreign intervention. And I mean, it's hard to know whose figures to believe, but it seems credible that Russia has lost probably 100,000 dead, multiples probably be injured. I mean, that's a huge casualty toll, and the longer it goes on, the more it will be, and it's blood and treasure. So look, I mean, I think that likely in the short term, we see Russia continuing trying to drive this offensive forward. It's getting stuck in the mud in Bakhmut. I mean, no large. I mean, this stuff about the push from Belarus, I think, is kind of total bull. I mean, the Belarusians would never fight. I mean, if Belarusian forces came in from the north with the Russians, the Belarusians would lay down their arms at the first point of conflict with the Ukrainians. There's no way, and they would gift all their weaponry to the Ukrainians, and then Lukashenko would have a nightmare at home because he lost any credible fighting forces he would have in Ukraine, and then I think regime change in Belarus is a possibility. So I think that we see a continuation of this incremental kind of push by the Russians, it kind of failing, and then probably this idea of a spring counter-offensive from the Ukrainians as they get these sort of Leopard main battle tanks, and this idea of trying to break or divide the land corridor to Crimea is a real possibility. And I think the danger still, the bias in my mind, or the risk in my mind, certainly, or the probability is that we do see the collapse of Russian forces in Ukraine, just because of the sheer volume of losses. And I think it's interesting. I mean, you've not mentioned it yet, but this week what was notable, I think, was this Chinese intervention.
Yeah.
And the first really credible peace effort. There was a Turkish process, obviously, last spring. China has been out to lunch on this whole war. I mean, really, the Chinese have been kind of rabbit caught in the headlights. They've had no policy at all towards this war. I mean, totally blindsided. Putin certainly didn't tell Xi that he was going to invade. So there's initially huge irritation, and then there's a period where I think the Chinese were kind of trying to figure things out, and then thought, well, maybe there's an advantage here. We can get some cheap energy from the Russians. This is going to undermine Putin, make him weaker. There's always been this kind of tension in China-Russian relations, right? The Chinese always thought they were the dominant partner, and Putin didn't. And I think this war definitely ensured that it was clear to everyone that the Chinese were the dominant partner and Russia was the minor partner. The Chinese like that. But I think what's changed, and I think the Munich Security Conference and the comments from Yi, the Chinese foreign policy guy, suggesting some kind of peace effort by the Chinese. I think what we're seeing there is the Chinese are realizing that Putin could actually win. Putin can actually lose. And there could be a devastating loss by Russia in Ukraine that could threaten regime change in Russia itself. And the Chinese certainly don't want that. So bring all this together, no route to victory for Russia, the Chinese signaling that they're really worried about a total defeat of Russia in Ukraine and ramifications for Russia itself and domestic political stability in Russia itself. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think...
And actually, on that stability within Russia, I mean, there's been a lot of talk recently about Putin potentially losing power, and a speculation about his health is one. Another is his credibility amongst the other senior people within Russia. There's talk of some of the ultras on the right taking over, from him. I mean, what do you make of all of those rumors that's swirling around? I mean, it's just hard to know. I mean, obviously, it's a time of war and stories, swirl like this.
No one knows, right? I mean, let's just go to the stuff, before, February 23rd, 24th, right? I mean, and all the stuff coming out of the Kremlin, people in the know, Russia doesn't want to invade. I mean, it's total bull again, right? I mean, no one had any insights at all, right? I mean, Lavrov, all the guys speaking around this, I mean, you couldn't get anything sensible from any of them, right? So, we don't know, the guys, basically in a compound or a bunker somewhere, he rarely comes out, he's in some kind of cocoon. I assume his security is pretty good, but, people I talk to are around the elite, certainly the oligarchic elites. I don't think they're very happy. I mean, any normal, sensible person looking at this, right? What has Russia achieved? I mean, honestly, where is the win here? Where is any win at all? Again, a huge loss of life, lost Ukraine forever, unified the West against Russia. I mean, the West was pretty disunified before the invasion. I mean, one of the big surprises for me is actually the unity of the West in support of Ukraine. There's no evidence of it cracking, right? So the West's been unified. Russian military capability has been proven to be, totally rubbish. I mean, Russia's not going to be able to sell any military kit globally anymore. I mean, they were flogging S-400s everywhere. I mean, why would any third power want to buy any Russian military kit? It's been humiliated in Ukraine. Russia was supposed to be a top-tier military power, peer with the US or China. It fought a fourth or fifth-rate military power in Ukraine. I think the Ukrainians would have admitted that at the start of the conflict. And they defeated Russia, right? I mean, that's just staggering, right? So and then there's the treasure, the sanctions, the outlook for the Russian economy is dreadful, stagnation, decline. All these Russian oligarchs, they can't access their houses and their football clubs and all that kind of stuff in the West. And living, I mean, the outlook, as I said, the outlook for is stagnation, declining living standards. Russia is now in an arms race with the West. I mean, your opening kind of comment was about Afghanistan. It is very similar to that early 80 period. Russia will have to, Putin will have to, he'll want to rebuild that 50% of his conventional military capability that has been lost in Ukraine, right? Thousands of tanks he'll want to rebuild. And now NATO is spending over 2% of GDP on defense, right? So just to keep up to rebuild everything he's lost and then to keep up with NATO, that's going to be a huge burden on a small Russian economy, right? $1.7 trillion versus, the combined West, I don't know what it is, $40 trillion, something like that. He just can't compete. And that means that difficult choices will have to be made. Again, guns versus butter. If Russia is going to have to spend lot more money on defense, military spending, there'll be, he won't be able to allocate many resources to keeping living standards.
I don't know what happened if Putin was to lose power. Would the country sort of become like an anarchic state? I mean, what would happen? I mean, if we just
it's a possibility. Look, there's a debate in Western academic circles at the moment that there's one view that, like the Macron comments, right?
Oh yeah,
we can't let Russia suffer a devastating defeat. We have to, think about poor Putin or whatever. I mean, typical Macron, right? I mean, that we should worry about what comes after Putin. Guys, I mean, how is it possible to be worse than this guy? This guy has invaded multiple countries in Europe, waged the biggest war in mainland Europe, since the Second World War. He's conducting genocide in Ukraine. I mean, anyone who doubts that, read his essay, right? Look what's happening in Bucha, etc., right? It is genocide against the Ukrainian people. The Russians have done it before. Holodomor, the 1930s, there's a track record there. He's used weapons of mass destruction in Europe already. Litvinenko, Salisbury, extraordinary against NATO members, right? I mean, I mean, Russia is evolving into a fascist state. I mean, that is fact. And how can it get worse than that? Honestly, so my sense is, my base case is the next leader after Putin will be someone like Putin, but not Putin, but someone who will basically want to somehow reset the relationship with the West and say, look, this has gone too far. This is not serving Russian interests on purpose. We need to move on from Putin. So, there is obviously, I don't believe the Kadyrov and the Wagner guy. I think if Putin goes, those guys will be taken out pretty quickly by other elites. I don't think they will be tolerated. I think there is a possibility of disintegration of the Russian Federation. as you know, I mean, it's made up of, lots of autonomous republics, Tatarstan, Chechnya, all these kind of places. It's a possibility. But actually, I'd even argue, should we be so worried about that? I mean, again, I started off talking about my background, my experience in the late Soviet period and watching the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, the IMF at the time was trying to stop the disintegration of the USSR into 15 republics. It hated the idea of 15 new countries, right? And actually, if you look back, I would argue the collapse of the Soviet Union overall has been a good thing, right? I mean, most of those countries are doing okay and a lot better than they were under Soviet kind of rule, right? I'm not sure actually that like I said, my base case is not that. In all likelihood, it will be someone more moderate than Putin, but not a liberal. If we do see centrifugal forces and disintegration, well, we'll see some new countries form, and now. I think the encouraging thing is you also have now engagement by China in the region and other regional powers. Turkey, for example, taking a much stronger interest, certainly in Central Asia. And I would hope that if we ended up in that situation, you still have a core Russia, which would keep the nuclear arsenal, and you may end up with new peripheral states that probably would have a similar future to countries in Central Asia that we see now, right? I mean, they're doing kind of okay.
Yeah, and moving outside of the Western countries, if we talk about China, but there's some other countries like India that have played an interesting role within all of this. The Western countries have tried to, I guess tell India to join them in their sanctions on Russia, but India's kind of has basically tried to be neutral, so to speak. I mean, what do you think about the broader EM countries that have all almost taken like a non-aligned position against Russia?
Well, the global South, right?
Global South,
yeah, been framed, right? I mean, I find it very frustrating, to be honest, and I get it. I get the anti-Western feeling. I mean, the Middle East uses sort of the Iraq War, Syria, the failed Western policy in Syria, the Arab Spring. I get all that, right? But and as someone who actually argued against Western intervention in the region in those particular conflicts, but the reality is that Putin committed war crimes in Syria, right? The West was wrong in not intervening against that. He's doing exactly the same in Ukraine, and it's wrong. We should intervene to stop it, like we should in Syria. And I would argue that the Iraq War was the biggest mistake, the biggest Western policy mistake since the Crusades, probably. It's a big statement.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's true. I mean, it's a different subject, but would we have had the instability that we see in the Middle East since?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
Would we have the migrant flow that we've seen? You could possibly trace the rise of populism in Western Europe and the West to those migrant flows related to the Iraq, the second Gulf War. But anyway, look, I get it, right? But for me, Russia's intervention in Ukraine is about imperialism and colonialization. Absolutely. And I just find it incredible that the global South kind of brushes that off, right?
I mean, if you listen to the Indian position, I mean, they sort of said this a year ago, that when it comes to Western problems, it becomes a global problem. When it comes to the global South problems, the West doesn't care. Moreover, the Indians are saying, for example, I mean, they're a poor country still. They need food, they need oil. They can't afford to not, secure those from Russia. So I mean, that's the position. And India presumably is a proxy for the global South in that stance.
Or maybe they should lobby Russia a bit more aggressively to stop invading another country. I remember, Ukraine is a poor country. It had a per capita GDP of $3,000 a head. I mean, I think it goes to a basic misunderstanding of this whole conflict, right? And people like Mearsheimer kind of bang the narrative, which is totally and utterly wrong. It's a false narrative. This war is not because of NATO expansion, right? I mean, it's interesting that, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and invaded Donbass in 2014 as well, when the last US tanks left emerging Europe in 2013, right? NATO expansion actually brought less NATO military capability, right? This idea that NATO expansion brought some kind of threat to Russia it's just not true. And the war in Ukraine happened, again, Ukraine was invaded and annexed in 2014 when the opinion polls showed the vast majority of the population didn't want NATO membership. Ukraine's military doctrine was anti-Western, not anti-Eastern. It had almost no military capability. It wasn't a threat to Russia. The fact that the Russians took Crimea in 3 hours just shows that, Ukraine absolutely was not a threat, right? I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine. It annexed Crimea because of Putin's imperial colonial agenda. That's fact. The global South I would think, would be interested in the opinions of Ukrainians who feel that and are suffering now. Probably hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have also died in this conflict, right? They are suffering.
And so in terms of global geopolitics, if we step back, there's the US on the one side, you have China as the two sort of big powers. You kind of have Europe, in the middle somewhere. Then you have, these regional powers, you could say, like India, maybe Saudi, Israel in the Middle East, and Brazil and LATAM. I mean, how do you see global geopolitics, post-Russia-Ukraine, conflict?
Well, it's becoming pretty binary. I mean, it's about, look, my view, and, as I said, I'm quite left-leaning in my political views, but I sound like a neocon on this issue. But now I have form in terms of, I spent 35, 40 years looking at, post-Soviet and post-Soviet space, right? I'd say is kind of my area of expertise. I think that, Putin is at war with the West. That's the reality, right? For whatever reason, he's got this problem about the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wants to recreate, Moscow's empire. He saw weakness in the West, the rise of populism, energy dependency, and he saw an opportunity, weakness in Ukraine, and he went for it. He went to try and take back what he thought was rightly Russian, which I would obviously disagree with. I would also argue that, Putin has been setting this up for a decade, right? People often focus on sanctions haven't worked, and they have pressed Russian economy. I mean, the reality is, Putin set up fortress Russian economic policies, economic settings. The fact that they have 600 billion reserves, they deleveraged. He's been preparing this for years, right? He knew he was going to do it. He built up that durability, and he waited for the right opportunity. From his perspective, the perfect position of ultimate weakness of the West, and he went in. He didn't expect the Ukrainians to fight. He didn't expect the West to be united against him. Big surprise. But it's done the opposite of what he thought he was going to do. And Putin, the master tactician, has proven to be totally false. But anyway, in terms of answering your question, I mean, he's made it clear he's at West with the West, with us, Western liberal market democracy. He hates it. It is a battle between autocracy and kleptocracy and our model. Right?
Yeah. But where does that place India, Brazil, Indonesia, like all of these emerging market, big kind of, or Turkey? Who do they align themselves with?
Well, it's a time where you've got to decide where you're going to be, right? I mean, I think, one of the really interesting takeouts for me is that, again, this idea of military kit and technology, right? And, many of those global South countries have been pandering to Russia to get access to S-400s and Russian kit as an alternative to sort of Western kit, because obviously, you might get F-16s from the Americans, but there's kind of lots of ESG related kind of KPIs around it, right? That they don't necessarily like. Actually, the fact that Russian military kit has performed so badly, right, actually gives the West more leverage. It's interesting. I would say that the better relationship we're seeing between Pakistan and the US is related to the fact that the military are much more eager now to get access to far superior Western military technology. They've recently done a deal on F-16 upgrades, right?
And Turkey, what about a country like Turkey? Because they were, they seem to be pandering in recent years to Russia a lot. Turkey's quite a interesting country in that respect. I mean, what do they do now? And they've been buying a lot of those S-400 that you talk about.
Well, I'm not sure they're very useful anymore. Right? I mean, that's certainly a couple of $1 billion that's maybe gone down the drain. Look, I mean, Turkey's a complicated story, and I think that I don't think it necessarily means that Turks want to be pulled out of the Western orbit, right? I think it just reflects the particularities of Erdogan's own difficulties in terms of the opinion polls and looming elections, right? He's obviously got his own balance of payments problems. He needs some cash. He's figured out that presenting himself as some kind of rival source of power, alternative source of power in the region for the Gulf guys, for the Russians, he's got a bit of leverage. They're writing him a few checks to enable him to ride through to the elections. But I think in the end, Turkey understands, I think, that access to Western military technology is key to its own defense. And I think when push comes to shove after these elections, whoever wins, there'll have to be some kind of normalization in the relationship with the West. Turkey's place is in NATO. I always hoped it would be in the European Union as well, but that's probably never going to happen. I guess the West understands that it's difficult for the global South. They rely on China for lots of things as well. Each country makes its own decisions, but I think you mentioned, I think there in your question somewhere about Europe not quite knowing where Europe.
Yeah.
Right. Actually, I think this conflict has made it crystal clear.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Maybe I was being too.
I mean, the French and Germans are kind of wishy-washy.
Yeah.
Right. But actually, I think I'm amazed by the unity of Europe and the West around this conflict. Right. And the kind of appeasers in France and Germany really are not the dominant voice. They're far the minority voice. And I think the minority voice, because their appeasement has totally failed. It's been proven to be a totally unsuccessful policy. It's let Putin get away with all this to the point that, he's invaded a country and caused a massive global energy crisis and huge humanitarian crisis in Europe. I mean, this guy is a bad guy, bottom line.
And what about the Central European countries that kind of border, the Ukraine and so on? So, like countries like Hungary, for example. I mean, how are they sort of positioning themselves?
Well, all of them are positioning. Well, all of them, perhaps with the exception of Serbia and Hungary, are positioning themselves firmly in the Ukrainian camp.
Yeah.
I mean, they all understand. They all have a Soviet Warsaw Pact history. They get it. They get Russian imperialism. They understand that if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, they're next. So I mean, I think they've been leading opinion, if anything, in response to this conflict. Now, the two ones I identified, Serbia and Hungary, are the ones that are less enthusiastic. Orban I find it extraordinary in terms of the Hungarian position, given 56 and Hungary's own experience of Soviet invasion, Russian invasion, I struggle to understand how Orban, coming from an anti-communist freedom fighter in the late 80s, can end up where he is now. Very disappointing. And I think there is I think he's isolated himself within Europe, and I think after this conflict ends, or maybe before, there'll be a reckoning with Hungary. I think there is unity around the fact that Orban, this is not a very, well, I was going to say, it's certainly not a very helpful policy. I could be a little bit more aggressive in what I say, certainly Europe's defense is on the line, right? European values, etc. And he's taken an approach that I think is very destructive, right? Serbia is again a little bit different. Obviously, they have an unaligned history. They have their own obviously experiences in the Balkan Wars, for Yugoslav succession, and they have the Kosovo issue as well. But even then, I've noticed in recent weeks, suggestions from President Vučić, I think, of some movements, some understanding that, if Serbia's, this idea of having to choose, is Serbia's long-term future in Europe, in the European Union, or something else, and I think Vučić realizes that in the end, Serbs will have to choose the European Union, and that means aligning on sanctions and stuff like that, and there'll have to be a resolution around the Kosovo issue, obviously.
Yeah. Now, if we move to a more profane topic, markets. Now, if we move over to more profane subject, markets and money, as an investor, how do you navigate these markets? So first of all, which markets can you still trade in the region, in CEEMEA? And how are you positioning in an environment where you have these geopolitical risks, as well as obviously the macro backdrop that we have?
Well, you can. You certainly in Russia you can't trade. Turkey's hard to trade. Local market, just because the unorthodox, crazy policies that we have at the moment from the central bank. So most people steering clear of that. You can obviously trade credit. Plenty to trade in Central Europe. You can trade local rates, lots of credit to trade. In the region, Ukraine, obviously, you can still give a view. Credit, local markets difficult to trade, obviously. I think the global story. Where we are. It's obviously the inflation growth. Where's Fed? Where are we in terms of Fed tightening? We're all on the same page, really. But I guess what's kind of interesting is the market has now got, as it often does, as you know, it's become comfortable with the war in Ukraine. It's taken the view that, which I agree with actually, that Putin cannot escalate. I think, I guess there was a view that the guy could play global energy markets, could use the energy card against Europe, could wreck Europe, was willing to escalate in terms of use of weapons of mass destruction, all those kind of things. And actually what we've learned, I guess, I've learned certainly, well, firstly, he's lost the energy war, right? I would argue, I guess I already hint about it, that he went when he did because he thought the climate transition would weaken his hand, right? Europe was moving away from dependence on Russian energy already before the conflict. And he thought if he didn't act this winter, his leverage would be much reduced. What we've seen, which has been quite remarkable, in particularly in Central Europe, is the impact of price, right? Markets. Prices go up, demand collapses. Who would have expected 25-30% drop in demand in Central Europe? That's been the key change. And I know people are worried about next winter. About whether Europe, maybe this year we were lucky, and China COVID and all that kind of stuff, and mild winter. But the way the price effects allowed demand to adjust, right, makes me think that actually we're through the worst of it, right? So his ability to kind of have global impacts, I think, is significantly reduced. I don't think he uses weapons of mass destruction. Although he's used them, I said, secretly, or not too secretly, in the Litvinenko and Salisbury case, but I don't think he would use it to extract vitriol leverage in Ukraine in particular. I mean, mass use of those weapons. So markets got comfortable with that. I guess, you'd say, well, what happens if I run off? And, we do see next winter problems in European energy. And, he does cross red lines about weapons of mass destruction. I mean, I think if he does that, globally, we're in a terrible place. I mean, if Russia is resorting to use of tactical battlefield nuclear weapons in Ukraine, I think we have a globally nightmare scenario with global markets in an extremely bad position. And I think one of the reasons he won't do that is because that impacts on China.
Yeah, presumably China, every country would then step up, against Russia in that scenario.
Yeah, so I don't sense to see that. So, but anyway, I think we're in a position where people are more comfortable with risks around Ukraine in terms of global impact, Russia and Ukraine. I'm of the view I'm relatively constructive in terms of I do see it relatively early into the war, either through a Ukrainian victory, or there's a possibility around the China peace talks that they could actually work. And you may say that's kind of incredible, but I can construct a scenario where, if you look at the 3 points of the Chinese peace plan, right, all that was suggested at the Munich Security Conference. Firstly, respect for Ukrainian sovereignty. Secondly, no NATO membership for Ukraine. And thirdly, the sort of nuclear. We don't want a nuclear war, right? Let's assume that we all agree on number 3. That's kind of low-hanging fruit. On sovereignty, for me, it would be a scenario where Russian troops withdrew to February 23rd, 2022 settings, right? So back to, possibly still staying in DPR and LPR, possibly still staying in Crimea, but agreements on negotiations about their long-term future, about Crimea and DPR and LPR, right? But Russian troops have to go back to where they were before the invasion last year, absolutely. There's no way the Ukrainians would accept anything but that. And then the interesting one, and I think that's doable, I think the Ukrainians probably would accept that. It would be painful, but they're not accepting the giveaway of those territories. They're just accepting further negotiations about their future. Interesting one is NATO enlargement. Again, I told you, this war is not about NATO enlargement. Absolutely not. It's about Russian aggression. But I think what is important is, I think the Ukrainians could accept some agreement that, they wouldn't get NATO membership. But what's important, really important, is security guarantees, right? What the Ukrainians care about, right, in the end, is they want some security structure that, they can be assured that Russia's not going to invade them again. Now, there's been talk of the UK and Poland and other NATO members possibly giving some security guarantees akin to what the US gives to Israel. I think that would be acceptable for the Ukrainians, also as long as they were guaranteed continued arms supplies to be able to enable them to defend themselves. So kind of, again, the state of Israel scenario.
Yeah.
Where I think the Ukrainians then, they can accept some kind of deal around NATO. The question is whether Russia would accept that, actually. Because, again, if like me, you think it wasn't never about NATO, it was about Putin taking Ukraine, then why would he accept a scenario that absolutely means he can never take Ukraine again, right? But I would argue the pressure from the Chinese, the seriousness of his situation in terms of the sheer scale of loss of troops and equipment, and global leverage and prestige and sanctions, etc., might mean he may well be interested to do that. So I can see a scenario in terms of the global impact where we see a relatively early end to the piece, and then it's interesting how the market would trade that, right? Would it see any security-related premium to energy prices drop? I'd imagine energy prices drop somewhat lower. Obviously, that may make people feel a bit more comfortable about the inflation story. It would be certainly risk on, around that scenario initially. I guess then the debate would be, obviously growth would rebound, there's China reopening, or whether, and then obviously the question that we're all asking ourselves is really, how entrenched is inflation ultimately, right? Which we're all asking ourselves, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, no, great. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here, so I want to pivot now to a couple of personal questions once again, because you've been around for a while now in both the markets, academia, and you've traveled the world a lot. So one question I wanted to ask you was, what's the best investment advice you've ever received from anybody?
What, apart from marrying the wife?
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's probably the best one. But best choice in life is probably that one. Best investment advice. I don't know. It's a hard one, right? I mean, I guess as an analyst, it's you're never going to be right all the time, right? And I guess it's classic one, right? It's learning from your mistakes, right? You learn more from the mistakes and dissecting those and understanding where you've got wrong and understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, right? And that's really important. And it's also something a young guy or person joining the industry, it's the same kind of thing, right? I mean, don't get, I guess in our industry, everything, as an analyst as well, it's about making the call, right? It's you're expected to put your balls on the line, have a view, have high conviction, particularly on the sell side, right, of research, and yeah, that is the job, but you're never going to get it right all the time. Let's hope that we're a little bit cleverer than the next guy. We get it right most of the time. But I think you learn a lot more from your mistakes, right? And analyzing those and figuring those out is important.
And you mentioned youngsters there. What advice would you give to youngsters leaving university to enter the job market today?
Wow, difficult one. Preparation. I mean, I always find that, some of the best guys I've worked with are the people that when they put a trade on, they do all their homework. Every angle is covered. Everything is well thought through. I mean, if you go into meetings, you're not prepared. I mean, you're not going to perform particularly well, right? But anyway.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then finally, to the books, are there any books that really influenced you over your career, or any books recently that you've really thought, hang on, that's a really good book?
Probably good books. I mean, Fiona Hill's book on Putin the Operative, well worth the read. I think she takes Fiona, I'm a massive fan of Fiona. She reads Putin really well. And I think that book, she gets into his mind, looks where he comes from, how he makes his decisions. Very interesting. Bill Browder's book, Red Notice, kind of made me cry. I mean, that's pretty. It's kind of a very emotional kind of book. Timothy Schneider, great book. Timothy Schneider, Bloodlands. I think if you want to understand Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, that whole space. I mean, it's...
Oh, yeah, I read that book. Horrific. I didn't quite realize how many times they got invaded during the war, by both sides, right, that central region.
I mean, you can get, the Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. I mean, you can understand, a lot about their future history or whatever, where they are now by reading. And he's written lots of other great works on Ukraine. But I think there are three ones that I really like, and I guess I learned a lot from them.
Yeah. And then what's the best way for people to follow you or, track your views?
Wow. Yeah. Well, obviously on Twitter, I'm quite prolific, I guess, on Twitter. A lot of that is Turkish stuff. I know Turkey is interesting because it's very polarized. So typically everyone hates me in Turkey because I try and be balanced, independent, right? And you can't please people. Anyway, whatever. Because both sides dislike me just because I say what I think.
That's probably a good thing. If both sides hate you, then that's probably a good sign. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so Twitter, I've got a Substack page at Tasha Khan.
Okay.
Both my Twitter and my Substack are at Tasha Khan. I'm quite unusual on the buy side. I write quite a lot.
Yeah.
BlueBay is a great place that they appreciate the fact that they allow me to write to because they value the fact that I put my views in the information exchange, right?
Yeah.
I put my views out there. You kick my size. I'm very often wrong, but I like feedback, right? So if you want to get on my Substack, have a look on there and reply, right? I mean, I like reading replies.
Yeah.
Some of them are a bit nasty sometimes, but whatever.
I'll include links to all of these in the show notes as well.
Yeah, sure. Perfect. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, with that, I mean, thanks a lot. I mean, it's been very great chatting to you and very comprehensive as always. And good luck this year with markets.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's going to be an interesting year again.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.